One man in Budapest is about to end Ukraine's war, and his name is not Vladimir Putin. In the last 72 hours, something happened inside the European Union that most people completely missed. A decision was blocked. A single vote was cast against the financial architecture that has been keeping Ukraine alive. And because of the way European law is written, that single vote is enough. One man in one capital city, sitting at one table, has just done what 2 years of Russian artillery, drone warfare, and winter missile strikes could not do. He has cut the financial oxygen supply to an entire nation fighting for its survival. This is Geo Insight Command, where power shifts are decoded before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this now, because what you are about to hear changes the entire calculus of this war. Here is what you need to understand before we go any further. Ukraine is not losing this war on the battlefield today. Ukraine is losing it in a budget spreadsheet, and the countdown has already started. Military analysts are already warning that the real threat to Ukraine's continued resistance in 2026 is not Russian armor. It is not Russian missiles. It is not even Russian manpower, which is being fed into the Eastern Front at catastrophic rates. The real threat is payroll. The real threat is the moment when a Ukrainian soldier, a Ukrainian border guard, a Ukrainian civil servant, or a Ukrainian hospital worker opens their bank account and finds nothing there. That moment, according to independent fiscal tracking, is now projected to arrive in May 2026. Let that sink in. May 2026. We are weeks away from that date right now. And the $90 billion EU loan that was designed specifically to prevent that moment from arriving has been blocked, not delayed, not renegotiated, blocked by one country, by one leader, by Viktor Orban. Now let's slow down here because this story has layers that most channels are not going to explain to you. The surface version is simple. Hungary vetoed the EU loan. Ukraine doesn't get the money. Crisis incoming. That is the headline version. But the real version, the version that intelligence analysts and European strategic planners are quietly panicking about, is far more complex and far more dangerous. Let's start from the beginning. Ukraine has been running what analysts call a wartime fiscal deficit since the first weeks of the Russian invasion in February 2022. That is not a criticism. That is simply the reality of what happens when a country loses major portions of its industrial east, when millions of working-age citizens flee abroad as refugees, when tax revenues collapse, and when every available budget dollar is redirected toward the military. You cannot fight a full-scale war and maintain a normal peacetime economy at the same time. That is not how wars work. Not. Ukraine understood this. The West understood this. And the entire architecture of Western financial support for Ukraine was built around one foundational assumption: that the money would keep flowing. Western governments, primarily the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and a coalition of NATO-aligned nations, committed to covering Ukraine's budget gap. Not just weapons, not just military hardware, actual government operating costs, teacher salaries, pension payments, police wages, hospital funding, the machinery of a functioning state. Because here is the thing that most people do not understand about modern warfare. You do not just need soldiers, you need a state behind those soldiers. You need an administrative apparatus that keeps society functioning while the military fights. The moment that apparatus collapses, the military begins to collapse shortly after, and that is exactly what is now at risk. The $90 billion EU loan, formally structured under the European Union's extraordinary support framework, was not charity. It was a structured financial instrument backed by the interest from frozen Russian sovereign assets, designed to give Ukraine a long-term sustainable funding runway through the most dangerous period of the war. Defense experts understand this was one of the most strategically important financial decisions the EU had made since the Marshall Plan. It was not just money, it was a signal. It was a declaration that Europe was committed for the long haul. It was the financial equivalent of locking in a position before the enemy could exploit a gap. But that signal has now been disrupted, and the disruption came from inside the house. Viktor Orban's government in Budapest cast a blocking vote against the loan package. The reason given publicly was a dispute over the Druzhba oil pipeline. Hungary, which is landlocked and heavily dependent on Russian energy infrastructure, has been in a running conflict with Ukraine over transit fees, pipeline access agreements, and the status of Hungarian energy imports that flow through Ukrainian territory. Orban's government framed the veto as a matter of national energy security. The pipeline dispute is real. The grievance, from Hungary's perspective, has a technical basis. But defense analysts and EU policy experts are now asking a harder question. Is this actually about the pipeline, or is this about something else entirely? Because here is what you need to understand about Viktor Orban. He is not a random variable in European politics. He is a calculated, strategic actor who has spent the last decade building an exceptionally unusual position inside the European Union, a position that gives him maximum leverage at minimum political cost. Hungary is an EU member state. It benefits from EU structural funds, EU market access, EU political protection. But Orban has systematically aligned Hungary's foreign policy posture closer to Moscow than any other EU member. He has maintained energy deals with Russia when other European leaders were cutting them. He has blocked EU consensus statements on Ukraine. He has met with Putin when other Western leaders were sanctioning Russian officials. And he has repeatedly used Hungary's veto power, the EU's requirement for unanimous decision-making on key financial and foreign policy questions, as a weapon. Military analysts are already warning that Orban has perfected what strategic analysts call asymmetric institutional leverage. He sits inside the system. He uses the system's own rules against the system. He does not need to challenge the EU openly. He simply needs to say no at the right moment. And he has done exactly that. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is the timing. Because Orban did not block this loan in a vacuum. He blocked it at precisely the moment when two other massive geopolitical crises are consuming every unit of Western attention, Western resources, and Western political bandwidth. The first is the ongoing confrontation with Iran. The second is the accelerating fracture inside the Western alliance over how to manage both crises simultaneously. And the intersection of these three pressures, Ukraine's fiscal collapse, Orban's veto, and the Western distraction of the Iran crisis, creates a strategic configuration that Russia's military planners could not have designed better if they had tried. Let's talk about Iran for a moment, because most people are watching the Iran situation as a separate story, but it is not a separate story. It is the same story. It is the same war playing out on two different stages. The Iran confrontation, which escalated significantly in late 2025 and into early 2026, has forced the United States and its allies to redirect significant military assets and attention toward the Persian Gulf and the broader Middle East theater. Carrier groups have repositioned. Air defense assets have been redeployed. Political capital, the kind that is required to pass emergency funding packages and sustain international coalitions, is now being spent on Iran. And critically, the physical hardware of Western air defense, specifically the Patriot interceptor missiles that Ukraine has relied upon to protect its cities and critical infrastructure, is now being consumed at an accelerating rate in a completely different conflict. Every Patriot interceptor fired over the skies above the Middle East in response to Iranian ballistic missile launches is one fewer Patriot interceptor that can be shipped to Ukraine. This is not a metaphor. This is a direct physical constraint. Patriot production lines are running at maximum capacity, and they still cannot keep pace with the dual demand. Defense intelligence reports suggest that the pipeline of air defense munitions flowing toward Ukraine has already been reduced as a direct consequence of Middle East requirements. Ukraine's air defense commanders are aware of this, and Russia's military planners are aware of it too. And this is where things get worse, because the Iran crisis has done something that nobody in the Western strategic planning community fully anticipated. It has dramatically increased global oil prices, the disruption to Persian Gulf shipping, the uncertainty over Iranian oil exports, and the risk premium now baked into every barrel of crude has pushed oil prices above $100 for the first time in years. And who benefits from $100 oil? Russia. Russia, whose entire war machine is financed by energy revenues. Russia, which has been operating under Western sanctions specifically designed to cap its energy income and starve its military budget. Russia, which was beginning to feel genuine fiscal strain as oil revenues declined in late 2024 and early 2025. Russia, which is now receiving a massive, unexpected, unearned windfall from the same crisis that is distracting the West and depleting Ukraine's support. The reality is that Russia did not cause the Iran crisis. Russia did not engineer the Orban veto, though Russian intelligence services have maintained close contact with Budapest for years, and the timing is, to put it diplomatically, convenient. Russia did not deplete the Patriot stockpiles, but Russia is the primary beneficiary of all three dynamics simultaneously, and that is not coincidence. That is what strategic analysts call convergent advantage, multiple pressures from multiple directions, all pointing toward the same outcome. And the outcome they are pointing toward is Ukraine running out of money in May. Let's talk about what that actually means, because running out of money is a phrase that sounds abstract. Let's make it concrete. Ukraine's government currently employs millions of people in functions that are directly or indirectly related to the war effort. Civil administrators who process logistics documentation for military supplies, border officials who manage the flow of equipment, infrastructure workers who repair power grids after missile strikes, police forces who maintain civil order in cities close to the front line, medical personnel who treat wounded soldiers and civilians, teachers who keep schools running so that the social fabric does not collapse. None of these people are soldiers, but all of them are essential to the functioning of the state that the soldiers are defending. If the payroll stops, these people do not disappear, but they stop working reliably. Some of them go looking for alternative income, others leave the country, others simply become unreliable in their duties. And as the administrative machinery of the state begins to seize up, the effects cascade outward and downward into the military apparatus itself. Supply chains slow down. Maintenance schedules slip. Command and control communications become unreliable. Morale, which is already under enormous pressure after years of grinding warfare, begins to fracture in ways that no amount of battlefield courage can compensate for. Military history is absolutely clear on this point. Armies do not fight in isolation. They fight as extensions of functioning societies. When the society behind an army begins to collapse, the army follows. Not immediately, not all at once, but inevitably. And the process, once it begins, accelerates. Intelligence reports suggest that Ukrainian government officials have been quietly signaling to their Western counterparts for months that the fiscal situation is approaching a critical threshold, that the reserves are burning down faster than anticipated, that the buffers are thinner than the public numbers suggest, and that the $90 billion EU loan was not a nice to have. It was the structural support that everything else was resting on. And Orban just kicked it out. Now let's talk about the options, because at this point in the story, you might be thinking that surely there are alternatives. Surely the West can find another way. Surely the EU can route around Hungary. Surely the United States can step in with emergency funding. And the answer to each of these questions is technically yes, but practically no. And that distinction between technical possibility and practical reality is exactly the gap that Orban is exploiting and exactly the gap that Russia is counting on. Option 1. The EU overrides the Hungarian veto through an alternative legal mechanism. This is technically possible under certain interpretations of EU treaty law. There are provisions for enhanced cooperation that allow a subset of EU members to proceed without unanimous consent in some policy areas. But using these provisions for a financial instrument of this scale, in this context, would require a legal challenge, a political consensus among the remaining 26 member states, and a willingness to trigger a constitutional crisis inside the EU at precisely the moment when the EU needs to project unity and resolve. Defense experts understand that the legal pathway exists on paper, but has never been tested at this scale. The political cost of triggering it could fracture the EU more severely than Hungary's veto itself, and the time required to navigate it extends well past May. Option 2. The United States steps in with emergency bilateral support to cover Ukraine's budget gap while the EU situation is resolved. This is the option that many European officials are quietly hoping for. But here is the problem. The United States Congress is consumed by the Iran crisis. Emergency supplemental funding requests for Middle East operations are already generating fierce political battles on Capitol Hill. The political appetite for additional Ukraine funding, at a moment when American military assets are already stretched, is at its lowest point since the war began, and the current administration has signaled repeatedly that it expects Europe to carry more of the Ukraine burden, not less. But that's not the real problem with option 2. The real problem is that even if the political will existed in Washington, the emergency funding pipeline has a physical timeline. It cannot be approved, appropriated, and delivered fast enough to prevent the May payroll crisis. The machinery of government funding moves slower than a burning reserve account. Option 3. Ukraine negotiates a temporary settlement with Hungary directly. Zelensky's government makes concessions on the Druzhba pipeline dispute, gives Orban the energy agreement he is demanding, and in exchange, Hungary lifts the veto. This is the option that sounds most practical on the surface, and there have been signals of diplomatic contact between Kyiv and Budapest on exactly this track. But here is the strategic trap inside this option. If Ukraine concedes to Orban on the pipeline under duress, it sets a precedent. It signals to every other actor inside and outside the EU that Ukraine can be pressured into concessions when its financial survival is at stake. It creates a template. And the next actor to use that template will not necessarily be a Hungarian prime minister with a pipeline dispute. It may be someone with far more dangerous demands. Furthermore, the concessions Orban is reportedly demanding go beyond the pipeline. According to defense analysis sources with knowledge of the backdoor negotiations, Budapest has been pushing for broader commitments on Hungarian minority rights in Ukrainian territory, on the political status of ethnic Hungarians in the Zakarpattia region of western Ukraine, and on Ukraine's long-term policy posture toward Hungarian energy infrastructure. These are not small technical adjustments. These are politically significant concessions that would generate serious domestic opposition inside Ukraine and potentially embolden other actors, Slovakia, Serbia, even elements within Romania, to make similar demands. Option 4. The EU emergency mobilizes alternative funding mechanisms through the European Stability Mechanism or through direct bilateral loans from large EU economies like Germany, France, and Poland, while the veto situation is resolved. This is the most technically viable short-term bridge solution, and it is almost certainly being discussed in Brussels and Berlin right now. But it requires political will from governments that are themselves facing domestic pressures. Germany is in a complex post-election coalition phase. France is dealing with its own fiscal constraints and a National Assembly that has been increasingly resistant to open-ended Ukraine commitments. Poland, which has been among the most staunchly pro-Ukraine voices in Europe, is approaching a political cycle that may constrain Tusk's room for maneuver. Option 5. Ukraine draws down its remaining reserves faster than planned, buys time, and bets on the veto being resolved or alternative funding being arranged before the full collapse. This is likely what is happening right now, in practice, behind closed doors in Kiev. It is the option of last resort disguised as a strategy, and it is also the option that is most dangerous because every week of reserve drawdown that happens without a resolution makes the eventual gap larger and the eventual crisis harder to manage. The truth is, there is no clean option here. There is no decision that avoids damage. Every pathway available to Ukraine, to the EU, to the United States, to Zelensky's government right now carries significant cost and significant risk. And the reason there is no clean option is not because of a failure of intelligence or a failure of planning. It is because one man, using one procedural rule at one carefully chosen moment, has successfully compressed all the options into a corner. This is what geopolitical leverage actually looks like. Not armies, not missiles, not sanctions. A vote. A single vote cast with perfect timing inside a system that has no override mechanism fast enough to matter. And this is where things get worse, because while the Western alliance is managing this internal fracture, while Brussels is fighting with Budapest, while Washington is focused on Tehran, while Berlin and Paris are calculating their domestic political risk exposure, what is Russia doing? Russia is not standing still. Russia is moving. On Ukraine's southern front, specifically in the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions, Russian forces have been making incremental but consistent territorial advances over the last 6 weeks. These advances have not triggered major international headlines because they are not the kind of dramatic breakthroughs that drive news cycles. They are slow, grinding, methodical advances of a few hundred meters here and a kilometer there. But military analysts who track frontline movements on a daily basis have noted that the pace of Russian advance in this sector has accelerated noticeably in the period that coincides with the beginning of the EU loan dispute and the escalation of the Iran crisis. Russia's military planners are not naive. They read the same geopolitical signals that any competent strategic analyst reads. They see the Western distraction. They see the fiscal pressure on Ukraine. They see the reduced Patriot pipeline. And they are using this window, not with a dramatic offensive, not with a flashy breakthrough designed to generate headlines, with patient, sustained pressure that exploits the degradation of Ukrainian defensive capacity that happens when budget pressure starts to affect maintenance, resupply, and morale. Defense experts understand that there is a lag effect in this dynamic. The financial pressure that begins in April and May does not immediately translate into battlefield collapse in May or June. The effects propagate over weeks and months. Soldiers who have not been paid on time do not immediately drop their weapons. Maintenance that has been deferred does not immediately cause equipment failures. Administrative dysfunction does not immediately shut down supply chains. But the damage accumulates, and 3 months of accumulated damage in a frontline military force is not recoverable quickly. The real question that intelligence analysts are now asking is not whether the May payroll crisis will cause immediate battlefield collapse. It will not, at least not in the first weeks. The real question is whether the May payroll crisis, combined with the reduced air defense pipeline, combined with the continuing Russian pressure on the southern front, combined with the erosion of Western political will that each passing month of the Iran crisis produces, creates a cumulative strategic deterioration that becomes irreversible by the autumn. And this is where the concept of a point of no return becomes relevant. Every military campaign, every long conflict has moments where the trajectory becomes locked in, where the balance of advantages shifts in one direction so decisively that no single intervention can reverse it. Western military historians point to specific moments in major 20th century conflicts where this tipping point was crossed, sometimes visibly, sometimes invisibly, and where the subsequent trajectory, however long it took to play out, was effectively determined. Ukraine's supporters in the West are acutely aware that such a moment may be approaching. And the frightening thing, The thing that is driving quiet panic in the corridors of NATO headquarters and EU foreign policy offices right now is that they cannot agree on whether it has already been crossed or whether there is still time to pull back from the edge. Because the reality is that the Western support architecture for Ukraine was built on assumptions that no longer fully hold. It was built on the assumption that the United States would remain the unconditional anchor of the coalition. It was built on the assumption that EU unanimous decision making would not be weaponized by a member state with Russian aligned interests. It was built on the assumption that no major competing crisis would consume Western military and political resources at a critical moment in the Ukraine war. Every one of those assumptions is now under pressure. Every single one. And what this means for the broader architecture of European security is something that defense analysts are beginning to say in private that they are not yet comfortable saying in public. It means that the post-Cold War European security order, the order built on the assumption of American leadership, NATO unity, and EU cohesion, has structural vulnerabilities that Russia has now identified and is actively exploiting. The Ukraine war was not supposed to expose these vulnerabilities, but it has. And once a vulnerability is exposed, it cannot be unexposed. The hidden truth in this story is that Orban is not acting alone and is not acting randomly. He is acting within a strategic logic that has been consistent for a decade. He has calculated with considerable sophistication that his position inside the EU gives him more leverage than it costs him, that he can extract concessions, payments, policy adjustments, and diplomatic deference from Brussels and Washington precisely because removing him or overriding him is more expensive than accommodating him. And every time the EU or NATO has chosen accommodation over confrontation with Budapest, that calculation has been validated. Military analysts are already warning that unless the EU is willing to fundamentally rethink its decision-making architecture, the Orban veto problem will not be the last crisis of this type. The unanimous vote requirement, which was designed as a safeguard for small member states against larger ones, has become an instrument for paralysis in exactly the moments when coherent action is most critical. And changing that architecture requires treaty revision, which requires, somewhat ironically, unanimous agreement. The structural trap is elegant in its cruelty. Now let's zoom out even further, because the story we have been telling so far is the story of a financial blockage, a veto, a funding gap, and a looming payroll crisis. But behind that story, if you know where to look, you can see the outline of something larger. Something that goes beyond Ukraine, something that goes beyond even the EU's internal governance crisis. What we are watching in real time is the stress test of the Western liberal order's capacity to sustain a long war. And the test is not going well. The Western order was built for a different threat environment. It was built for deterrence, for the credible threat of overwhelming force that would prevent aggression from occurring in the first place. It was not fully built for the long, grinding, resource-intensive, politically costly reality of actually fighting a peer or near-peer adversary through a proxy over an extended period of time. The institutional mechanisms, the budget processes, the coalition management tools, the decision-making procedures, all of them were optimized for the peace that deterrence was supposed to maintain, not for the war that deterrence failed to prevent. Ukraine has exposed that gap, and Russia has learned from watching that gap be exposed. And the lesson Russia is drawing is one that should concern not just Ukraine, but every country in Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, in the Indo-Pacific, that has structured its security on the credibility of Western commitments. The lesson is this: if you can find the financial pressure point, if you can find the institutional fault line, if you can apply pressure at precisely the moment when Western attention is divided and Western political will is depleted, then you do not need to win on the battlefield. You need to win in the committee room. You need to win in the budget office. You need to win in the quiet, unglamorous, undramatic space where the machinery of a sustained war effort either holds together or falls apart. Russia has been learning this lesson for 2 years. And in the current moment, with Orban's veto in place, with the Iran crisis consuming Western bandwidth, with oil prices above $100 filling Russian coffers, Russia may have found the configuration that makes that lesson actionable. But this is where I want to be careful, because this story is not over. And the outcome is not determined. Ukraine has survived moments that looked like terminal crises before. In the spring of 2022, when Kyiv itself seemed under threat. In the winter of 2022 and 2023, when the missile campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure pushed the energy grid toward collapse. In the summer of 2023, when the counteroffensive failed to achieve its objectives. In late 2024, when U.S. congressional gridlock threatened to cut off military assistance entirely. Each of those moments looked from the outside like the beginning of the end. Each of them was survived. Zelensky's government has demonstrated a capacity for institutional resilience, diplomatic creativity, and operational adaptability that has consistently surprised outside observers. The Ukrainian state, despite everything, has continued to function. The Ukrainian military, despite everything, has continued to fight. And the Western coalition, despite its fractures, has continued to provide support. Defense experts understand that institutional resilience is not unlimited, that each crisis, each near-death experience, depletes reserves, erodes buffers, and reduces the margin for the next crisis. And the question being asked now, in April 2026, is whether the cumulative depletion of those reserves has finally reached the point where the next shock cannot be absorbed. The May payroll deadline is that shock. It is not abstract. It is not a theoretical future scenario. It is a date on a calendar. And as of today, the financial mechanism designed to prevent it has been blocked. So where does this leave us? What is the world looking at as this situation unfolds in real time? It leaves us looking at a European Union that is functionally divided on its most consequential foreign policy commitment. It leaves us looking at a Western military-industrial complex that is being pulled simultaneously toward two major theaters and cannot fully satisfy either. It leaves us looking at a Russian government that is more financially comfortable than it has been in 2 years, that is making measured territorial advances, and that has every reason to believe that patience is its strongest weapon. And it leaves us looking at a Ukrainian government that is running out of time, running out of money, running out of reserve capacity, and facing a decision about which of its terrible options is the least catastrophic. The world did not plan for this configuration. The strategists who designed the Western response to the Russian invasion did not model for a scenario where a member state inside the EU would use institutional veto power to block the financial lifeline at the precise moment when a separate Middle Eastern crisis was consuming Western resources and driving up Russian oil revenues. That specific combination was not in the war games, and that is precisely why it is so dangerous. Intelligence reports suggest that Russian strategic planners have been monitoring the Orban-EU dispute closely and have made internal assessments that the May fiscal crisis, if it materializes, could accelerate their Southern Front strategy significantly. Not because Russian forces are poised for a breakthrough, they are not in the sense of a decisive military operation, but because the cumulative degradation of Ukrainian defensive capacity over the summer months, if the financial pressure is sustained, could open opportunities that are not currently available. And that is the real danger here. Not a sudden collapse, not a dramatic defeat, a slow, grinding, invisible deterioration that is happening below the threshold of public attention, sustained by a structural blockage that one man in Budapest has the power to lift or maintain based on calculations that have as much to do with Hungarian domestic politics as with the fate of Ukraine. This is what power actually looks like in 2026. Not the power of armies, the power of institutional position, the power of perfect timing, the power of a veto cast by one leader in one committee meeting in one European capital. And somewhere in Moscow, in a building on Staraya Square, or in a dacha outside the city, someone is watching this unfold and thinking that the patience was worth it. The question that is now being asked at the highest levels of European and American policy, in rooms that are not open to the public and in conversations that are not on the record, is simple and devastating. Can Ukraine survive the month of May? Can the West repair its institutional fracture fast enough to matter? Can Zelensky find a diplomatic solution that does not create a precedent that destroys Ukraine's long-term position? Can the EU find a legal mechanism to route around the veto before the payroll collapse begins? And perhaps most importantly, the question that nobody wants to be the one to ask out loud. If Ukraine's government funding collapses in May, and if Russia uses that window to make decisive territorial advances over the summer, and if the Western coalition cannot rebuild its support architecture fast enough to reverse those advances, what does the world look like on the other side of that? What does European security look like when the precedent has been set that a sustained Western commitment can be broken through financial pressure and institutional paralysis? What does it look like for Taiwan, for the Baltic states, for Georgia, for every country that has structured its security assumptions around the reliability of Western support? That is the question that this story is ultimately about. Not just Ukraine, not just Hungary, not just the EU loan, but the credibility and durability of the Western order itself under conditions of sustained strategic pressure from adversaries who have learned exactly where its fault lines are. This changes everything, not just for Ukraine, for all of us. Share this, because most people have not connected these dots yet. Most people are watching the Iran headlines and the battlefield updates and not seeing how they fit together into a single strategic picture. That picture is what we decoded today. And if you want to stay ahead of the next shift before it becomes tomorrow's crisis, you know where to find us. Geo Insight Command, where the real story runs deeper than the headlines.